We have Andrew McGuiness coming to us from the University of Sydney, and he will present his paper, Music, Phenomenology, and Habitus. Welcome, Dr. McGuiness.
Hello. Okay, so this is the phenomenology of time and music listening. Bourdieu, in The Logic of Practice, describes habitus as a spontaneity without consciousness or will. I aim to show that Husserl's investigation of the phenomenology of perception shows the possibility in responses to music of an openness to a revised habitus. I will be taking a narrow perspective on Bourdieu's theory of habitus, focusing on that aspect of habitus which Bourdieu referred to as hexes. In doing this, I will be concerned only with short timescales, where individual motor actions and short sequences of actions can be found. For Bourdieu, habitus is a system of durable, transposable dispositions, which function as principles which generate and organise practices and representations. Habitus thus determines both the perceptions and the actions available within any situation, as well as the representations of the world and the individual's place within it. Habitus is a matter of similarity, but not uniformity within a social group, and variation between different social groups. The personal style of an individual is no more than a deviation from the style of the social group to which the individual belongs. The dispositions of habitus are internalised as second nature. They are forgotten as history and become a state of the body rather than of the mind. As such, they're not available to reflexive analysis by those who possess them or are possessed by them. Habitus should not, however, be thought of as mechanical, but rather as being adaptive to different situations while producing dissimilar outcomes. It should be distinguished, for instance, from merely mechanical habit. In terms of music performance, the deep knowledge of a particular style, which is expressed as a disposition to make the same kind of musical decisions in similar situations, an expression of habitus, is distinguished from what musicians know as muscle memory, which is a mechanical habit and not adaptive. Bourdieu identifies homologies between different areas of practice within a social group, which he says are based on the transfer of schemes from one activity to another. Of particular interest in this regard is his notion of bodily hexes, which he defines as political mythology realised, embodied, turned into a permanent disposition, a durable manner of standing, speaking, and thereby of feeling and thinking. And this is a matter less of particular activities and the techniques by which these are accomplished, and more of a consistent comportment of the body which is exhibited across a range of practices, as enacted by a particular social group. A concrete example of homology of hexes is a tight-lippedness which Bourdieu found in different bourgeois uses of the mouth, such as eating, speaking, or laughing, and which contrasts with a slack-mouthed pattern of the working class. It is just the expression of habitus through hexes that I will argue can be revised through responses to music. Bourdieu asserts that phenomenology fails to carry out the ultimate reduction, which would reveal the social conditions of possibility of the phenomenological epoche. Phenomenology can therefore give only a description of the life world which is complicit with doxa, that is, that which is beyond question because taken for granted. Bourdieu does, however, recognise crises, those situations where it comes about that habitus no longer suffices as a basis for action. The critique, which brings the undiscussed into discussion, he says, the unformulated into formulation, has as its possibility objective crisis. It is when the social world loses its character as a natural phenomenon that the question of the natural or conventional character of social facts can be raised. For Bourdieu, crisis situations call for an extraordinary discourse which provides heretical power in offering the means of expressing experiences usually repressed. On this account, liberation from repression arrives through language and explicit heterodoxy. Could there be a way in which habitus, which Bourdieu insists shapes bodily expressions, might be revised directly on the side of the body? Such a revision of bodily habitus might occur through two closely related functions, perception and motor action. I will first outline some relevant features of Edmund Husserl's phenomenology of perception. Perceptual experience, for Husserl as for Bourdieu, is structured by past experiences, in fact, by habits acquired in the past. We inhabit a world in which perceptual meaning is constructed below the level of awareness according to acquired habits. Husserl's phenomenological reduction, the bracketing away of the natural attitude of belief in the object of perception in favour of the essential matter, or hyle, underlying the respective perceptual experience, reveals, in the case of vision, a series of profiles or aspects of the object. These hyletic data are experienced as different phases in a single perceptual event by virtue of the phenomenologically experienced unity of the object. In Husserl's words, we find such concrete, really immanental data as components in more inclusive concrete mental processes which are intentive as wholes. And we find those sensuous moments overlaid by a stratum which, as it were, animates, which bestows sense, a stratum by which precisely the concrete intentive mental process arises from the sensuous, which has in itself nothing pertaining to intentionality. End quote. Changes in hyletic data during a perceptual event are at least sometimes correlated with kinesthetic data. Walking around a table, turning the head, directing the eyes, are movements which produce different profiles or adumbrations of the table. Both the hyletic and the kinesthetic data are normally left below the level of awareness. Our intentionality is towards the object, which transcends and unifies this flux. It is within the temporally extended event of perception that habit constructs perceptual meaning. According to Husserl in the analyses concerning passive and active synthesis, the part demands the whole. Something uniform awakes something else that is uniform, which is not yet at all constituted as a unity explicitly for itself, and does not demand the whole by a pure and simple awakening, but rather by a co-connected expectation, by the demand as coexisting, as co-belonging to the unity. End quote. Thus, there is an apperceptive expectation, whereby hyletic data prompt a perceptual recognition of the object as a whole, and thus the expectation of subsequent hyletic data which will fulfill that expectation. There is a unification of current, previous and expected future hyletic data in intentionality. Each moment of the perceptual event comprises retentions of previous adumbrations, the currently experienced hyle, and pretensions or anticipations of future hyle. Retentions, pretensions, and hyletic data in general are not normally objects of intentionality, but rather contribute to the overall perceptual meaning, the recognition of the object of perception. Hyletic data are available to consciousness, but the construction of perceptual meaning does not require the intervention of awareness. Rather, the retentions form a system which prescribes the possibilities for what will come next in the perceptual event. Every perceptual givenness is a constant mixture of familiarity and unfamiliarity, a givenness that points to new possible perceptions that would issue in familiarity. It is within this process of anticipation of perceptual completion, based on habitual or sedimented perception, that revision can occur. Husserl introduces the possibility of disappointment rather than fulfillment in the perceptual process. For example, if we see a uniform, well-rounded red ball, but further phases of perception reveal that the backside of the ball is in fact green, not red, and indented rather than uniformly ball-shaped, then a conflict between the sense data and the still living intention occurs. But, says Husserl, there is not only a conflict. By being presented in the flesh, the newly constituted sense throws its opponent from the saddle, as it were. The new sense, green, in its primordially impressional force of fulfillment, is a certainty that has a primordial force which overpowers the certainty of the anticipation of being red. We are now conscious of it as overpowered. So we have not a smooth reorientation of intentionality to accommodate the unexpected sense data, but rather a continuing conflict of original and revised retentions and intentions. According to Husserl, a retroactive crossing out in the retentional sphere takes place, such that, quote, we would find in all the horizons of these retentional components not only the previous prefiguring and the previous structures of expectation and fulfillment, just as this prefiguring was originally motivated at that time, but we would find superimposed upon it the corresponding transformed prefiguring that now points continually to green and indented. For we are still conscious of the previous sense, but as painted over, and where the corresponding moments are concerned, crossed out, unquote. Now this might be called a perceptual crisis. Where such a retroactive crossing out of attentions occurs, the conflicting adumbrations have, as Husserl says, the same mode of validity, questionable, and each presentation that is questionable is precisely in dispute and contested by the other. So much for the perception of physical objects. How does all this apply to music listening? The perception of a physical object is a perceptual event. Music, on the other hand, is not an object but an event in itself. It is surely no accident that Husserl used a melody as the paradigmatic example of perception in his lectures on the phenomenology of the consciousness of internal time. Music maps out the temporality of the perceptual event explicitly. As with the perception of an object, with music there are current presentations of homiletic data, retentions and anticipations, and an intentional object which unifies all these. We do not, however, have the same kind of kinesthetic data correlated with the sequence of adumbrations as are found in object perception. With music, the time course of homiletic data is outside of our control as listeners. I will argue that motor engagement is nevertheless intimately involved in music perception. The temporal scale with which I am concerned is the scale of what is known as the specious present. This is the interval of time in which sense data are felt to be present in some sense of being vividly accessible, although some are already a little way into the past. It might therefore be referred to as the perceptual present, and our experience of it should be understood to be different from our experience of memory. These retentions and protensions are contained within a limited temporal window, such as a single perceptual act can encompass. In Husserl's words, the tones of a melody form a successive unity with a common effect, the apprehension form. Naturally, the latter is consummated only with the last tone. There is, accordingly, a perception of unities that succeed one another in time, just as there is a perception of coexisting unities. And since that is the case, there is also a direct apprehension of identity, equality, similarity, and difference. End quote. As with object perception, there is a continuous intention towards what Husserl calls the apprehension form, which is experienced as a unity, albeit potential and anticipated, from the start. As with object perception, there are anticipations which conform to the overall apperception and which are susceptible of disappointment rather than fulfillment, and retentions which may be subject to retrospective crossing out. In short, the possibility of perceptual crisis is contained in musical perception, and with it, the means to revise habitus. An important aspect of Husserl's description is that it explicitly recognises the existence of unities at two nested levels, that of the individual note and that of the melody. This is a quote, that several successive tones yield a melody is possible only because the succession of psychic events is united at once into a total formation. They are in consciousness successively, but they fall within one and the same total act. End quote. The two timescales evident here coincide with the two levels of temporal integration found in motor activity. That of a few hundred milliseconds, the duration of a basic motor action, and that of a few seconds, the duration of a planned sequence of motor actions. Music is often organised at just these timescales. The smaller time unit, corresponding to basic motor actions, is marked by the tactus or beat of the music. The smaller temporal units may not be confined to single notes, as in Husserl's deliberately simple example, but may comprise, for example, short rhythmic or melodic cells. The longer period, corresponding to sequences of motor actions which are planned as a unit, can be found in regular or irregular concatenations of beats, such as the measure. The motor engagement of the listener is invited through motor mimesis, which tracks relationships between the adumbrations at the temporal level of basic motor actions to constitute an intentional object which corresponds to the musical event at the level of the planned perceptuo-motor sequence. There are, of course, longer timescales involved in the reception of music, which I will not address here. Joel Kruger argues that bodily gestures in response to musical events can act as a kind of attentional focusing. Bodily movements, such as gently swaying back and forth, bobbing one's head, tapping fingers and toes, modulate our perception of music by modulating our relation to features of the music, such as melody and metre. And there is abundant empirical support for this view. We might add to this the sense of how different elements in a musical texture relate to each other and how this might be expressed by the body. Motor engagement in response to music is hardly a novel idea, of course. My concern here is to emphasise that the co-presence of motor and perceptual habitus in music listening, the possibility of perceptual crisis, and therefore the possibility of revision of the embodied habitus, as opposed to the linguistic heterodoxy which Bourdieu finds offered in objective crisis. Motor engagement with music, especially the committed motor engagement of dancing to music, can be expected to allow a revision of bodily hexis, the comportment or bearing which is consistent through the various activities of normal life. The details of how specific musics achieve this for particular bodies must wait for another time. Some obvious candidates for investigation would be hip-hop in the Bronx of the late 1970s, the funk of Parliament and James Brown, and EDM scenes of various kinds. It is important to note that what is posited is not a complete freedom from habitus, a casting off of all constraint. Rather, the idea is that the revision of hexis which music listening, and in particular dancing to music, sometimes makes possible is a contrary or alternative homology, produced in opposition to a homology which the group finds oppressive, whether consciously or not. According to Susan McClary, the musical power of the disenfranchised more often resides in their ability to articulate different ways of construing the body, ways that bring along in their wake the potential for different experiential worlds. So, in conclusion, I've argued that a component of habitus, as defined by Bourdieu, bodily comportment or hexis, is susceptible of revision through perceptual crisis, as it occurs through motor engagement with music. Perception, in Husserl's phenomenology, unfolds in time with a series of sense data which are unified in the intentionality towards the object of perception. Perceptual crisis occurs when an intention resulting from habitual perception is disappointed by a conflicting sense presentation. This results in a retrospective crossing out of retentions and the continued presence in phenomenal experience of those retentions and the corresponding intention as cancelled out. Music listening exhibits a similar temporal structure within the perceptual event with the same possibility of perceptual crisis. Husserl identifies two timescales in music perception, which I have argued correspond to the level of individual motor actions and the level of planned sequences of actions. Motor responses are intimately engaged in making sense of music, and this underpins my argument that a perceptual crisis in music listening can result in a revision of motor habitus or hexis. Thank you.